1980 Fire It Up tour with Rick James and the Stone City Band. And special guest, Prince.
And why would you turn it down?
They wouldn't let me produce myself.
You were 15 at the time.
Sugar on my candy cane. That's right, it's been a long time since I had a man that did it real good. If you ain't scared, take it out. I'll do it like a real.
Some people have said that a good rivalry always stems from the similarities that one has to one another. Take Betty Davis and Joan Crawford, for example. Both legendary actresses from the golden age of Hollywood, made each other, had their fair share of fans, and if I'm not mistaken, Joan Crawford did attend the Oscars. And when she won the Best Picture, Betty Davis appeared on the same movie as her. Accepted the Oscar for her and stuff like that, which that was crazy as hell. And then even like when it comes to the music industry, there's a lot of views where a lot of people think that, oh, he stole my style or he was jealous of such and such style. Like take Aretha Franklin and Natalie Cole, because Natalie Cole around that time, like when she came out in 1976, 77, people were calling her the new Queen of Soul. And a lot of the songs that she recorded for her first couple of albums were songs that Aretha declined, pretty much. Even in the hip hop world, like you have 50 Cent and Ja Rule, which again, that's another feud, which is a video by itself, story by itself. Both rappers are from Queens, born within the year of one another. Always some similarities in the music industry where people think that one is stealing their style. However, the story between the feud between Prince and Rick James probably took it to another level, in my personal opinion. What started out as a tour between the two ended up being what I want to call like the shading, the trifling, the he said, she said, stole my style and whatnot. I mean, yeah, this is a very interesting story and stuff like that, you know what I'm saying? Hi. My name is Reg, and welcome to another episode of What the Beef. And today's episode we're going to talk about is the beef between Prince and Rick James. Now, this episode took a lot of research. I had to go through the books I had to go through interviews, I had to go through archives, and this is probably one of my most creative episodes to date, in my opinion, because, for one, both Prince and Rick James, two of my favorite artists of all time. And not a lot of people know that they went on tour with one another, like during Rick James Fire It Up tour, but I'm getting way ahead of myself at the moment. Alright, so let's get this shit started. So we're gonna start the story off in 1978. And the reason why I want to start the story off right there is because Rick James at that time, he was on fire around that time and shit like that. So by early to mid 1979, Rick James had already dropped 2 albums for Motown, and stuff like that. The first album, Come Get It, it was released on April 20th, 1978. Wow, it was actually released on 420. Anyway, singles albums known for are You and I and Mary Jane. Album eventually went gold, peaking at number 13 on the U.S. Billboard 200 and the R&B charts number 3. Yeah, this is pretty much one of my favorite Rick James albums and stuff like that. Just the funkiness of it all. I mean, one of my favorite tracks, believe it or not, is actually the intro, that Stone City Band High track. Oh my god, that bass line was so dope and stuff like that. Just a dope album all the way, man. And then he followed that up in 1979, January 26th to be exact, with busting out of L7, which busting out of L7, man, that's like my favorite Rick James album, period. Singles, his albums, I think only came out with 2 singles, just Busting Out on Funk and Fool on the Streets. This peaked at number 2 on the R&B charts and number 16 on the Billboard 200. And by that time, Rick James was literally on fire around that time. Like, he had single-handedly revived Motown in a way and stuff like that. Cause Motown during the late 70s was kind of not really as successful as it was in the past, cause they were like losing a lot of popularity around that time. Plus with other labels, especially Philadelphia International doing its thing and stuff too. And so, while Rick James was doing his thing, another artist had dropped an album in 1978, and that artist was Mr. Prince Rogers Nelson. Now, this cat, Prince, pretty much dropped his debut, For You, in 1978, and the singles albums came up with was Soft and Wet and Just As Long As We're Together. Because he pretty much played all the instruments, produced his whole album. Album peaked at number 21 on the Top Black album and number 163 on the Billboard Top LPs and tapes. For You is definitely a very solid album. That's definitely for a lot of diehard Prince fans and stuff like that. And so, with that album, it didn't really make a lot of impact as, Warner Brothers thought it would make. And around that time, too, Warner Brothers was telling Prince that he had to owe them a lot of money. He had to owe them a lot of money due to the commercial disappointment For You in their eyes and stuff. And so, in 1979, like, back to Rick James, he had also just released his 3rd album, which was Fired Up, also in 1979. Now, he had dropped this on October 16th of 79. Singles albums known for was only came out with 1 single called Love Gun. This album peaked at number 5 on our US R&B and number 34 on the Billboard Top Albums. To keep it a buck, this is not really one of my favorite Rick James albums and whatnot. Not really one of my favorites. It kind of went a bit disco in certain parts, but like I said, with this it's an album definitely for diehard Rick fans and shit. It's been out of print for years, and it's kind of hard to come by to this day and age. And so, to promote the album, Rick was getting ready for the Fired Up tour, and that same time, Rick was hearing the news about Prince, and so Prince had released his 2nd album literally 3 days after Fired Up, the self-titled joint. This was released in 1979, and it had singles like I Want to Be Your Lover, Why You Want to Treat Me So Bad, very underrated song right there. Still Waiting, and Sexy Dancer. Yeah, man, this album right here, it definitely got him a lot more, commercial success and stuff like that. He pretty much wanted to get a hit, and the song that, excuse me, the song that really put the album out there was the "I Want to Be Your Lover" track and stuff like that. So that was like a huge song back in like '79 and whatnot. The album peaked at number 3 on the top R&B album and number 22 on the Billboard 200. And so, yeah, man, Rick was definitely taking notice. He was definitely taking notice when it came to Prince. A little trivia. He was so he wanted Prince to be his opening act for the Fighter Up tour so bad that he actually bought the self-titled album, and his personal favorite track on the album was "Sexy Dancer." So this little trivia for y'all. Now at this point, things were going smooth between the two artists. Their management talked to one another, and they were yeah, definitely getting ready to to get some shit started with the tour. Now, according to Rick James's The Confessions of Rick James Memoirs of the Super Freak book, he described his first meeting to Prince as this, and I quote, "The first time I saw Prince and his band, I felt sorry for him. Here's this little dude wearing high heels, playing this new wave rock and roll, not moving on anything on stage, just standing there wearing this trench coat. Then at the end of his set, he'll take off his trench coat, he's wearing these little girl bloomers. I just died. The guys in the audience just booed the poor thing to death." Unquote. Yeah, now it should be noted that during the first couple of tour dates and whatnot, pretty much, Prince, he was kind of getting a little booed during the initial days of that tour. But however, certain boos, they started fucking with him and stuff like that. And a lot of this has to do with allegedly, and this is coming from many members from each other's parties, that Prince would watch Rick James on stage and pretty much, get inspired by him and stuff like that, you know what I'm saying? And so what really set this off was one time when Rick got mad because he caught Prince stealing his chants in his microphone tricks, and they got a little testy or whatnot, you know what I'm saying? So it got to the point like Des Dickinson, when asked about this little feud between them, he just thought that Prince had the best response because of the freshness of his sound at that time. Because Prince, one of the differences between Prince and Rick James' music was, while Rick James had like this very funky, dirty sound, like Prince, he himself had a funky, dirty sound, but he was definitely a lot more influenced on that new wave stuff, you know what I'm saying? So, yeah, man. And so, what ended up also happening was the fact that pretty much, when it came to Rick's band and Prince's band at that time, they didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of things, you know what I'm saying? Because according to Rick James, he pretty much said that Prince's band was pretty standoffish, they were pretty snobs and stuff like that, and he really did not respect Prince's band because they didn't really play on the record, which we all should know, and so he felt some kind of way about that. So once the tour still went underway, and stuff like that, and they got to the point where Rick James talked to Prince's manager, and even his manager, accused Prince of stealing Rick's act, which was crazy as hell and stuff like that. And so, it got to the point where there was like a lot of tension going on and whatnot. And so according to Prince's former bandmate and close friend Andre Simone, he pretty much confirmed about Rick James and the Prince beef where Prince's band was a bit standoffish. But he also confirmed about an incident that happened on April 2nd, 1980, where pretty much while they were on tour, Simone, he loved Howdy Doody sketches, and he also was a fan of the ABC sketch show Fridays, which that show was pretty much ABC's answer to Saturday Night Live, hence the name. And so what had ended up happening was Simone pretty much drew a picture of Howdy Doody on a chalkboard in the dressing room, and Rick James was pretty much having like a welcome home celebration with a large group of people since he's from Buffalo, and people included his mother and the mayor of Buffalo at that time. And so somebody added braids and sprayed cologne on the picture, and apparently they wrote Rick James underneath the picture. And so Rick James and the guests, they were pretty embarrassed and stuff like that. And so this is what really caused the moment where the two bands had to have a sit down together. That shit's crazy. Damn.
I was trying to, and look, here's the thing. The thing is, we're on tour and we're opening for Rick James.
Yes.
Originally, we were supposed to open for Kool and the Gang.
Oh, okay.
But, we were at this, it's funny because that's when we met Sheila E., because we were at the Circle Star Theater. And I remember we were opening for Kool and the Gang, and I mean, we were completely killing it. I mean, it wasn't a big place, but I remember it was the whole Bubble Yum thing, because Prince was in the Bubble Yum, and girls were liking that whole thing.
And so as Rick James' band met with Prince's band in Prince's room, while the band was patching up the differences, according to Rick James, Prince just sat in the bed quiet as a mouse and stuff like that. So yeah, man, definitely funny ass shit. But Simone also talked about an incident that happened during like the first gig where Rick James pretty much pulled out a gun at Simone, like a fake gun. And according to Simone, he said, and I quote, "It was not a real gun, I guess, but the love gun or whatever, it was that he had," unquote. And he basically made a response where he said, "If you point a gun at me, you better pull the trigger." And so pretty much, Andre Simone was pretty much trying to relate to the fact that, Rick James had a hit at that time, Love Gun, off the Fired Up album, but it wasn't really known why he did it. I guess he was just trying to fuck with Andre Simone and stuff, so yeah. And even in another recent interview by Morris Day, who was, of course, the lead singer at the time, and another one of Prince's friends, he did a recent interview on Vlad TV where he gave his own opinions about the Rick James and Prince beef, and he said that he didn't really feel that Rick James had any ill will, but he was just threatened by Prince's. And what is perhaps the most infamous incident that happened on tour was one night Rick James had a birthday party, and it was like a very lit party. It's a Rick James party, so what do you expect? And so that same night, Prince actually arrived, and Rick James, he wanted to really get under Prince's skin. So he got a bottle of cognac. He walked up to Prince, grabbed Prince by the back of his hair, and poured cognac all the way down his throat. And everybody laughed and whatnot. Prince, he spit the alcohol out. He spit the alcohol out, and he basically just walked away and stuff like that, Rick James, he pretty much talked about this in his book, and I quote, "Soon after that episode, there was a birthday party for me. Prince came. He was sitting at the table with some people not drinking. I walked up to him, grabbed him by the back of his hair, and poured cognac all the way down his throat. He spit it out like a little bitch, and I laughed and walked away. I loved fucking with him like that. Later on, he would fuck with me, but for now, it was all about Rick James." Now, Rick James took his hatred to print, to Rolling Stone magazine, and he said, and I quote, "I can't believe people are going enough to buy Prince's jive records. Prince is a mentally disturbed young man who's out to lunch. You can't take his music seriously. He sings songs about oral sex and incest," unquote. Now, the year 1980 brought a lot of transition for both Prince and Rick James. Now, I'm going to start with Rick James. So Rick James, pretty much after the release of the Fired Up album, he wanted to go to the islands, the Caribbean islands to be exact. And while he was at the Caribbean islands, he was pretty much influenced by the laid-back atmosphere and the vibe of the Caribbean, and that pretty much was the inspiration behind his album Garden of Love. Now, Garden of Love was released on July 16th, 1980. The singles that it was released was on Big Time and Merry Go Round. It charted on number 83 on the Billboard Top LP and number 17 on the Billboard Top Soul LPs. Yeah, this album at that time was considered like a disappointment commercially by a lot of Prince fans, but in my personal opinion, I've always liked this album. It's probably like my personal favorite Rick James albums. Like, had a lot of dope cuts, like, Big Time, of course. Summer Love that joint right there. That's a class. That should have been a single though, but yeah, it is what it is. And so, the commercial disappointment for that album, he pretty much went back to Buffalo, New York, to get back to his roots. And while Prince
Mary says she wanna be happy, and she doesn't want to be there.
was doing that, Prince, on the other hand, was getting ready to release his next album, and he was very influenced by the popular new wave music at that time. And so, around 1980, he, of course, went back to his hometown of Minnesota, and he wanted to cut an album pretty much. And the problem was, when he was recording the album, was the fact that there was limited space when making the album, which Prince explained in an issue of Rolling Stone, and I quote, "Nobody knew what was going on, and I became totally engulfed in it, and it really felt like me for once." And so with that being said, on October 8th, 1980, he released his third album, Dirty Mind. Now, Dirty Mind was released, and the singles that it was released with was Uptown, Dirty Mind, and Do It All Night. It charted on number 45 on the top LP and tapes, and it also charted on number 7 on the top black albums. This album right here, was a very important album. In my opinion, this really broke through the whole Minneapolis sound. I mean, a lot of dope shit was on this album, in my opinion. Like, I love the song, the title track, the song When You Were Mine, that ended up being covered by Cyndi Lauper, I want to say in 1984. But my favorite joint was Head. That was my favorite joint right there. So, also a little trivia about that album. Morris Day, he actually co-wrote the song Party Up, and Prince loved the song so much that he offered Morris Day, the band The Times and stuff like that. So that's a little trivia too I want to throw out. And despite, the cult status that the album will soon be followed by, around that time the album was considered like a commercial disappointment compared to like the previous album. But it gathered, despite Rick James' Garden of Love, it gathered a lot of acclaim from music critics, for its diverse sound, and it was really like the first true Prince album. So, the tour was pretty much planned, and this is the thing about the Dirty Mind tour. Just like Prince wanted with the Fired Up album, Prince needed a strong opening act to open him up for the tour. Meanwhile, Tina Marie was dropped from Rick James's current tour at that time. She was dropped because the tour was about to go in debt. So Tina Marie, of course, went over to Dirty Mind Bill after Prince had asked her. And one of the things that you should know was the fact that Tina Marie had a backup singer by the name of Jill Jones. Now, you guys have heard that name Jill Jones before for all my Prince heads, but she was pretty much, if you guys remember the movie Purple Rain, she played the waitress, the girl with the blonde hair. And also, y'all should definitely check out the self-titled album she dropped in '87. Very, very underrated album. A lot of dope joints by Prince. Check out the song All Day and All Night. Love, love, love that joint. But anyway, back to the story. And Jill Jones, she definitely knew Rick James when she was growing up, because at that time, she started working with Tina Marie when she was 15, and at that time, she was 17. And Rick James pretty much knew Jill Jones because he was close with Jill Jones' family, and he used to attend a lot of the barbecues and the function that they had. So while Jill Jones and Tina Marie were on the Dirty Mind tour, that's when she met Prince. And for a girl that young, Jill Jones, she was pretty much aware of the business, and she was pretty much aware about who Prince was. And she pretty much put on the front, of course, but she was quickly inspired and loved his musical talent. And all of this information came from Alex Hahn's book, The Rise of Prince, 1958 to 1988, which that book right there is a very, very, very dope book right there. So for all my Prince heads, y'all should check it out.
One time. Are you ready?
So the Dirty Mind tour was a huge success, and right from that stage, it was the beginning of the sexually progressed performances, because during the Dirty Mind era, he used to perform like nearly naked and stuff like that, and he would also had like a spiky haircut and had like a rude boy pin to his coat, because that rude boy quote was basically from the Skyheads. And so while he was talking about like the punk influence in the early 80s, he pretty much said, and I quote, "All the groups in America seem to do just exactly the same as each other, which is to get on the radio. Obviously, the New Wave thing has brought back a lot of that greasy reality. There are so many of those groups that there is just no way many of them can make it in those vast commercial terms. So they have no choice but to write what's inside of them. I think it's all getting better, actually." Unquote. So, now it should be noted that when we are discussing the careers of both Prince and Rick James, I want to also dedicate this section to deciphering the similarities between the two and stuff like that, because they have similar similarities when it comes to like their careers, live performances, the people who influence them, and so on and so on. Now, when it comes to the people who influence them, it's really no secret, because I'm really going to talk about the common influences at first. So, both Rick James and Prince was, of course, very influenced by Sly and the Family Stone. Of course, Sly Stone himself being as prolific as he was during that the late 60s to early to mid 70s. Also Prince was very influenced by Larry Graham's group, Graham Funk Railroad, which ironically, him and Larry Graham would end up working on a lot of music with one another, beginning like in the late 90s, when Prince converted to a Jehovah's Witness, because Larry Graham was a Jehovah's Witness as well too. Rick James also said in an interview that he was influenced by the Bar-Kays, most specifically Larry Dotson, the lead singer of the Bar-Kays. And Larry Dotson, for those of you who don't know, definitely, if you guys seen his live stage performances, you can tell, well, even Rick James and to an extent even Prince got his style from. Like, he definitely was an underrated cat when it comes to like funk music and shit. Singing wise, definitely Rick James he's claimed that he was influenced by a lot of Marvin Gaye, which I've talked about that when I talked about Marvin Gaye's episode why he left Motown, which Y'all should definitely check that out. That's definitely a very dope episode, if I should say. Also, he would say he was to be influenced by Otis Redding too. Now, when it comes to Prince, some of his main influence, like I've mentioned, was James Brown and Sly Stone. But a lot of people would say that when it comes to like his style, like you can say Little Richard also had an influence on him because Little Richard was having a very flamboyant style at that time. This was like when the beginning days of rock and roll and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? Guitar playing, you can see a lot of influence, from Jimi Hendrix too. And so, when it comes to like his guitar playing, his bass guitar playing, I will also throw in Bootsy Collins. Also speaking of P-Funk, definitely Rick and Prince definitely had their share of influence from P-Funk as well too. Just like Larry Graham, Prince would also do a lot of music with George Clinton. Most specifically, 1988, The Cinderella Theory from George Clinton. When it comes to singing, Prince was definitely influenced a lot by, again, Marvin Gaye and Al Green and whatnot. You know what I'm saying? So, and it's interesting how he was very influenced by Al Green because of the fact that Prince also had a gospel touch in his music as well too. So, yeah, man, that's when it comes to the influences. Now, when it comes to their similarities, they also have to say that they were very prolific, not only in songwriting and producing, but also bringing up new talent. And so I'm going to start with Rick James. Rick James from the first album had his band, the Stone City Band, which consists of members Denise Hughes, Tom McDermott, Nate Ghetto Hughes, Levi Ruffin, Oscar Alston, and Danny Linnell. So in 1980, they dropped their first album, In and Out, and that album, it definitely, wasn't like a big success at that time, but it had some joints like, there was this one joint called Little Runaway and stuff like that, which was a pretty slow, dope song. It has songs like Party Girls, but a lot of people have said that it pretty much sounded like a Rick James album, pretty much. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I don't really think Rick James sung on that album, if I'm not mistaken, because I've never heard those albums too. So they dropped a few more albums through the 80s, but they were not really as big and whatnot. And so while Rick James was pretty much, had the Stone City Band, Prince at that time, besides having what was soon to be the Revolution, he had his first protege band called The Time, which The Time, consisted of members Morris Day, Motown Moore, Jelly Bean Johnson, Jesse Johnson, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. Yep, them. Jerome Benton. Yeah, consists of all those members. And despite the Stone City Band, The Time actually did have success on their own. Their debut album came out in 1981, the self-titled debut, as I should say, and that album had singles such as Get It Up, Cool, and Girl. And so that album charted at number 50 on the Billboard Top LP and number 7 on the Top Soul LP. Yeah, I love that album, but it was the second album, What Time Is It, that really put them out there. Like, that was known for singles like Gigolos Get Lonely 2, 777, 9311, and The Walk. That album, charted at number 2 on the Top Soul LP and number 26 on the Billboard 200. Like, that album right there definitely was very dope album, very funky. Morris Day definitely doing his thing on that album and stuff. So, yeah, man. Now, when it comes to both Prince and Rick James, both of those artists had love for female artists as well too. And I'm gonna start off with like the girl groups that each respective adult artist had. Rick James, of course, you guys should know, had the Mary Jane Girls, which the Mary Jane Girls consist of members JoJo, Sherry, Candy, and Maxie. And he always had those girls, most of those girls backing him up in when it comes to his performances and songs and whatnot. But he was really serious about having a girl group during after the Throwing Down tour around 82, 83. So his concept was to have 4 girls, which was a Valley Girl image, a Classy Vamp image, a Leather Queen image, and one with, and I quote, a Rick James bitch image. The original name for the girls was supposed to have been called the Colored Girls. And so he pretty much, Rick James pretty much showed the concept of Prince Manager with 3 girls in lingerie. And that's where, Vanity 6 came about. But I'm going to get into Vanity 6 in a minute. And so Rick James went to Motown. He went to Motown originally because he wanted JoJo to have a solo career. But there was a few miscommunication and they ended up signing an all-female group. And that's when he had to change the name for the Colored Girls to the Mary Jane Girls. Hence 1983, the self-titled Mary Jane Girls album came out. This album came out in 1983 and it was known for singles All Night Long and Candyman and Boys. Man, All Night Long, man, that song right there is a timeless classic song. It's been, believe it or not, it's been like my introduction to that song was from Redman, because Redman sampled that song for Tonight's the Night from the What The album. He also sampled it from Can't Wait from Darius and Darkside, man. Classic albums right there. Like, he really put me on that shit. Also, with that album, it charted on number 56 on the Billboard Top LP, and it also charted on number 6 on the R&B charts. Yeah, man, that album right there was very, very dope album. Love that album. And they also came out with Only For You in 1985. That was like the album that really had their big song In My House, which that song right there was a very, very big track right there for 85. That was, I want to say that was the most successful single. And so there was other songs like Wild and Crazy Love and Break It Up. And that album was a lot more, in my opinion, it still had that traditional Rick James sound, but around that time Rick was experimenting himself too. And so he kind of gave it on with that album. So that album charted at number 18 in the Billboard Top LPs and number 5 on the R&B charts, And like I said, I want to say that was their most successful album. Now, they were supposed to come out with an album called Conversation, which it also had songs like a cover version of Hollywood, the Rick James song from the Come Get It album. But around that time, Rick James and Motown had that falling out, because he said that Motown was not paying him his royalties, and Rick James was going through a lot of stuff during like the late 80s, and pretty much the Mary Jane Girls pretty much broke up after that because he had a falling out with them too. But I'm gonna save that when I talk about when Rick James left Motown, because that episode is gonna be in the works. And so yeah, that's when the story with the Mary Jane Girls. Now when it comes to 96, Prince wanted to form a girl group when it came to 3 of his female friends, and those are Brenda Bennett, Jamie Shoup, and his girlfriend at the time, Susan Moonseed. Just like when Rick James suggested name for his girl group, Prince originally wanted to call them the Hookers. And so, this is like around the time, where Prince was just filthy with his music. And the reason why he wanted to call them hookers was because, he had a vision that, the three women would perform in lingerie and sing sensual songs about sex and orgies and like fantasies and whatnot. And he was also influenced in making a girl group. And this is like a rumor. It's not really noted if it's true. When he saw the Barbra Streisand movie, A Star Is Born, But I don't know if that's actually really factual or whatnot, you know what I'm saying? So don't quote me on that. And so, he started working on a few demos. Some of the demos, included a song I call Wet Dreams or whatnot. And the interesting thing about Vanity 6, which was yet another link, was that in January of 1981, Denise Matthews, she was Rick James' date at the American Music Awards, while Prince persuaded her to join his girl group, you know what I'm saying? And so, this is going back to when Rick James told Prince's manager about the girl group, and next thing you know, Vanity 6 had come out. And Prince pretty much stole Vanity from Rick James. Because then he ended up renaming Denise Vanity and whatnot, because it was supposed to have been a play on. Originally, she was supposed to be called Vagina. But then, okay, I'm sorry, I gotta be serious, but he ended up playing it safe by naming her Vanity. But there was also a lot of other rumors about why she was named Vanity, because, there was other stories about him looking at her in the mirror and him calling her Vanity because she pretty much was a female version of Prince and whatnot, you know what I'm saying? So, which, I've heard that story plenty of times. I heard that story plenty of times too, so, yeah, man, that's wild. That's wild as fuck. I never knew about the vagina part, but crazy. So, when it came to fast forward to 1982, he pretty much renamed the group Vanity 6 and whatnot, and yeah, man, the image was very outlandish. I wouldn't even say it was more outlandish when it came to, in comparison to not Vanity, of course, but to the Mary Jane Girls. And so, in 1982 was a very prolific year when it came to Prince. He released the 1999 album, and he also released the Times What Time Is It album. And that same year, he dropped Vanity 6's self-titled debut album. And that album had singles such as He's So Dull, Nasty Girl, which I want to say that was the biggest song off the album, Drive Me Wild, and Bite the Beat. And so, yeah, that album right there was charted at number 6 on the Billboard R&B charts and number 45 on the Billboard 200. Yeah, that album was a very dope album. I mean, Nasty Girl definitely was a very big song. I love the beat to that track right there. Had a lot of writing credits, like with Prince. You had Des Dickinson, Jesse Johnson, Terry Lewis. I mean, definitely a very, very, very dope album. And it's been out of print for years, so if y'all try to find that album, then good luck to you on that. Be prepared to pay an arm and a leg for that album. And so, around the time too, despite the success of the Vanity 6 album, Denise was pretty much, while she was dating Prince, she pretty much developed a drug addiction and stuff like that, And so, with that being said, she ended up, breaking up with Prince, around the 80s and shit like that, And she had left the group in the Prince organization, and she ended up being a solo artist on Motown Records. Now that leaves Vanity 6 in a very awkward position because of the fact that now you had both Brenda and Susan both Brenda and Susan, who had replaced Jamie Shute, both of them in Need for Speed member. Now fast forward to 1984 and stuff like that. You had the movie Purple Rain coming out, and originally Vandy was supposed to play. She was supposed to play, Princess Love interest in the movie. But then next thing you know, you had Apollonia Cotero, replacing Vandy and stuff like that. And so Prince and Apollonia definitely did their thing. Apollonia, she definitely had, some credentials in her career at that time. She appeared on music videos with Ray Parker Jr. and Eddie Money, and she also appeared on the ABC film The Mystic Warrior. And so with Apollonia, joining the Prince organization, they ended up, releasing the album Apollonia 6 in 1984. And that album had a song Sex Shooter and Blue Limousine. In my opinion, this album was cool, but I was more a fan of the Vandy 6 album. I felt like the Vandy 6 album was a lot more raw. It was a lot more funky and whatnot, you know what I'm saying? Not that to say was the Apollonia 6 album a bad album, because it definitely had a lot of joints on that album as well too, but I just personally was a fan more of Vandy 6, Now, as I talked about the female groups, let's not forget that they also had their share of solo stars too. And so, back to Rick James, there's so many to count when it comes to his solo acts. So I'm just going to start with the most obvious, which was Tina Marie. Now, the union between Rick James and Tina Marie happened after Berry Gordy was impressed with Tina Marie's singing, and she had wanted Rick James to produce an album for Tina Marie. Mind you, at that time, too, Rick James was supposed to produce an album for Diana Ross. But, with Tina Marie, he loved the way Tina Marie was singing, and so he was working a lot with her. He worked on the album Wild and Peaceful in 1979. And the interesting thing about that album, it didn't even show her face. It just showed like an ocean view and whatnot. And that album was a very, very, very dope album. It led to people thinking that she was black. And so that album peaked at number 18 on the Black Albums chart and number 94 on the Billboard album chart. The singles, I want to say the single that was released was I'm a Sucker for Your Love. I love that track. And I also had a cover version of The Temptations' Don't Look Back. So, that was, again, Rick James and Art Stewart, who I've mentioned in the Marvin Gaye episode as well too, worked on that album. And so, with the success of Wild and Peaceful, Tina Marie definitely, excuse me, she performed on Soul Train in 1989, and she actually became the first white female guest on Soul Train, and she performed on I'm a Sucker for Your Love with Rick James, which that is like one of my favorite Soul Train performances and whatnot. And she actually was the most performed white act on Soul Train because she performed about 8 times and stuff. Yeah. And so pretty much Rick James became busy, and so Tina Marie worked on the second album, Lady T, with Richard Rudolph, which, if you guys know that name, he is the widower of Minnie Riperton. Minnie Riperton, very dope singer. She had passed away the previous year in 1979 from breast cancer, which Tina Marie actually dedicated the album to Minnie Riperton. And she named the album Lady T because that was a nickname that Tina Marie had on Motown Records. That album had singles such as, what was the single? Can It Be Love and Behind the Groove. It charted at number 45 on the Billboard Pop Albums and number 18 on the Top Soul Albums. Yeah, this was a nice improvement over the first album. I love the album cover is definitely very dope and shit like that. Very dope album cover. Um, yeah, man. And so that same year, just like Rick James, Tina Marie was also very prolific too because she pretty much decided to do the Irons and the Fire album that same year, where this was the first album where she produced all by herself, and it was actually dedicated to her father, who had passed away 4 years prior. And this is actually Tina Marie's favorite album. It peaked at number 9 on the Black Albums chart and number 38 on the Pop Albums chart. And it has singles such as I Need Your Lovin' and Young Love. Man, this is another very dope album and shit like that. So yeah, this album right here, very dope. And Tina Marie definitely, she pretty much was like, I want to say one of like the few Rick James affiliates that actually made a name on her own. Because, you know, she left Motown around the mid-80s to Epic Records, and she still dropped dope albums and whatnot. So yeah. Now let's talk about Val Young. Now, compared to Tina Marie, Val Young actually was very prolific in the music industry before she met with Rick James. She was discovered by George Clinton, who pretty much hired her for a background vocalist for his group, The Brides of Frankenstein. And you know, she also worked with artists such as Roy Ayers. She sang a lot of background songs for the Gap Band. Well, it wasn't until that she met Rick James that pretty much that was what took her career to the next level, because she pretty much sang on a lot of background tracks during the Bustin' Out tour. And so Rick James was so loved her musical talent that he pretty much promoted her as the quote-unquote Black Marilyn Monroe. And so he brought Val Young to Berry Gordy, and Berry Gordy signed her to Motown. And again, you have the album Seduction that was released in 1985. That had singles such as Mind Games and the title track, Seduction. And he had Piece of My Heart and If You Should Ever Be Lonely. I never actually heard a lot of Val Young stuff. She's always an artist I need to definitely check out though. Cause the album peaked at number 39 on the R&B albums chart. And you also had the album, she also, you know, worked on the album Private Conversations that came out in 87. And so Private Conversations came out, and that album had songs like only single that was ever released was the title track, Private Conversation. But compared to Seduction, it wasn't a strong commercial success because, like I said before, Rick James had his issues with Motown Records. That, you know, Val Young left the label and signed to Hemmer's Records. You know what I'm saying? Because that's when she released Private Conversations there. And you know, she ended up being a guest vocalist and singing background vocals for a lot of artists. Most notably on a Tupac song, To Live or Die in LA, off the Don Illuminati, the 7 Day Theory album, which was a very, very, very dope album and stuff. And finally, I can't talk about the female stars without talking about the one, the only, Sheila E. Now, Sheila E. was a Prince affiliate, definitely. But like Val Young, she made a name for herself because she started out like with the group with the family, and you know, she was always known to play the drums. And you know, she made her recording debut on Alphonso Johnson's song Yesterday's Dream. And you know, she also, you know, played for songs with Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, Lionel Richie. Also, she had also joined the George Duke Band. But again, you know, it wasn't really until she met Prince at a concert in 1978, because pretty much, you know, she was performing with her father, and the Prince was definitely taken aback by her musical talent. And so, pretty much, she definitely, made a mark for herself during the Purple Rain era, where she appeared on the song Erotic City, which was like the B-side to Let's Go Crazy. Love that track right there. Ironically, George Clinton, he did a cover of that track too, which is also very dope. And so, fast forward to 1984, she dropped the album, her debut album, The Glamorous Life. That album, that was known for singles such as Glamorous Life and The Belle of St. Mark. That album charted at number 28 on the Billboard 200 and number 7 on the top R&B and hip hop albums chart. Man, that album right there is so very dope. Another very dope album, from Prince. Yeah, man, definitely did his thing with this album. And so, with that being said, the success of that album would result in her dropping the second album 1 year after, called Romance 1600, which that album pretty much was another album where her and Prince definitely did their thing. They had singles such as Sister Fate and Love Bizarre, which Love Bizarre, that was like the most notable single from the album. Album charted number 12 on the R&B hip hop charts and number 50 on the Billboard 200. Yeah, I've always liked the album a bit better than Glamorous Life, believe it or not. This album definitely got a lot of hype too because, she had also appeared on the Crush Groove movie. That's a hip hop classic right there, Crush Groove and shit. So, yeah, man, like Sheila E. was definitely on the roll, again, making a name for herself, outside of Prince, similar to Tina Marie. And, in 1987, she had dropped this self-titled third album, where she pretty much worked on this album. She did the majority of the writing for this album. The single that was released was Hold Me and Cuckoo. The song Love on a Blue Brain was the first single that was only released in Japan. And I know a lot of diehard fans love this album, but commercially it kind of fell a little down. It was number 24 on the top R&B and hip hop albums chart and number 56 on the Billboard 200. So yeah, that's how it come when it came to girl groups and stuff like that. Both Prince and Rick James, with their female acts all together, definitely brought out a variety of music ranging from the pop all the way down to Latin, all the way down to funk. Now, continuing on with the story. Now, fast forward to 1981. Rick James released the album that would ultimately change his career forever. And that album would be Street Songs. Street Songs was released in 1981, and it featured the singles Give It To Me Baby, Super Freak, Ghetto Life, and Fire and Desire. It would end up being, I want to say, this album would end up being Rick James' most successful album, I want to say. It's either this one or the Cold Blooded album, I know that. It peaked at number 3 on the US Billboard 200 and number 1 on the R&B charts. Man, this whole album was a game changer for Rick James and whatnot. A lot of dope cuts was on this album. Like a little trivia on a few tracks. The song "Make Love to Me," believe it or not, it had background vocals from Janae Du Bois, who, if you guys don't know, she was Walona from Good Time. She also sang the Jeffersons theme song, which I didn't even know that until like a couple of days while I was researching for this video. So, also, the song Super Freak, which would end up being Rick James' signature track, that was like the last song recorded for this album. And while I was watching the Motown 40 documentary, he pretty much was talking about how they said, I think the label executive saying that he never had a song where and I'm just gonna paraphrase, where white people enjoy. And so Super Freak was just that joint because like the way he was singing the song, it was like him mimicking how white people would think they're cool and whatnot. And he pretty much, like, you know, the part where they had that high pitch vocal like da fika. He pretty much was mimicking the whole the new wave sound and shit like that. Which hence Prince again was influenced when he was making the whole Dirty Mind album. So yeah, man, that was something very, very interesting about this album. So Super Freak definitely was the song that really pushed this album forward, in my opinion. Yeah, man, this whole album was such a game changer. Definitely Rick James went back to his roots. And according to Tina Marie, the thing that was really surprising was the fact that Rick James stole Prince's synthesizers and used them on Street Songs album, and he sent them back to him with a thank you card. That's crazy, man. That's fucking crazy. And you know, speaking of Prince, he ended up releasing his next album that same year, Controversy. Yeah, man, Controversy, that's that fucking album, man. Like, that album is so fucking dope. Singles album was known for was Controversy, Sexuality, Let's Work, and Do Me Baby. Album charted at number 3 on the top R&B and hip hop albums, and it pretty much peaked at number 21 on the Billboard 200. Yeah, this album right here definitely was another improvement, you know, over Dirty Mind and whatnot. You know, a lot of people have pretty much said this was pretty much Dirty Mind 2, but he kind of went a little versatile. He started talking about some different things, like, you know, the song Ronnie Talked to Russia was, you know, aiming at, you know, Ronald Reagan, and, you know, Annie Christian was talking about, like, the murder of, you know, John Lennon and the African American children in Atlanta, you know, the whole Atlanta murders and stuff. So up to this point, you could pretty much say that this was like his political album. You could pretty much say. But yeah, Controversy, definitely a dope album. So what ended up happening was both of them would end up going to the 1982 American Music Awards. And this is when shit hit the fan. Rick James pretty much won for favorite album when it came to soul R&B.
Street Songs, Rick James!
I would just like to thank, first of all, the creator who brought me here, and my mother who's sitting over there, who I give this award to. The band, the Stone City Band, Record Plant Studios, Motown Record Promotion staff, Barry Gordy, and everybody who made this humanly possible.
And also around that time, him and Prince pretty much almost got into a fist fight, because the story goes, according to Rick James's Glow book, Rick James's mother, you know, wanted an autograph from Prince because Prince was, you know, big at that time. You know, she was a huge fan of him. And Prince pretty much looked at her and ran away. And Rick James was mad. He was just like mad at this fact and stuff like that. And he got into his manager, and his manager, you know, found Prince and made Prince, you know, apologize. And no fight ended up broken out. And Rick James, he laid it on set, and I quote, he was a little disappointed because I really did want to kick his ass. Mom was beautiful. She was oppressed with stars and never tried to hide it. In fact, she collected autographs. Guess who I just saw, James, she said to me. Who? Prince. You didn't ask him for his autograph, did you? I sure did. Why? Because I like his music, son. I think he's great. Okay, so now you have Prince's autograph, which I did. When I asked him, he just turned around and walked away. You're kidding. No, I guess he don't like giving autographs. That's all I needed to hear. I chased after that little turd and caught up with him and was about to lay him out with his manager and stepped in. What the hell is wrong with you, Rick? Asked the manager. I told him Prince had dissed Mom and that was going to kick his scrawny ass. Prince explained that he didn't know who his mom was. Well, now you know, motherfucker. Prince will be happy to apologize to your mother, said the manager, and he will be happy to apologize to you. Yeah, that all came from the Glow book. And so, fast forward to 1983, and Prince, he took the cover on the R&B magazine Blues and Soul. And again, he really laid it on to Prince. He doesn't want to be black. My job is to keep reality over this little science fiction creep. Unquote. So moving on into 1983, Rick James, was getting ready to release the album Cold Blooded, which he released in August 5th of 1983. Singles album was known for was Cold Blooded and Ebony Eyes. The album was very successful. It pretty much charted at number 16 on the Billboard 200 and number 1 on the R&B charts. Another solid album from Rick James, in my opinion. Again, not really the biggest Cold-Blooded fan compared to like his previous works, but it's still a pretty solid album. I'm just going to leave it at that. And so, when it came to like the personnel change, that was also the year that the Mary Jane Girls had dropped their self-titled album, and the Mary Jane Girls pretty much underwent like a minor change because Sherry had pretty much left the group to pursue a solo career. And pretty much, Rick James pretty much said that she was never a strong solo performer and whatnot. And so the girl who ended up taking her place was a girl named Yvette Brooks. And so, Yvette Brooks was definitely nicknamed Corvette. And, the Mary Jane Girls definitely was popular again. And they also contributed to the Cold Blooded Tour. Now, the Cold Blooded Tour was one of Rick James' successful tours in history. The Mary Jane Girls was opening for Rick James, and he pretty much, was at his peak in his career. Like 83 was pretty much him at his absolute peak. But then again, one night, he was chilling with Rod Stewart and his then wife Alana, and Frank Sinatra's daughter Tina, and her boyfriend Bob. And also that one night, the Mary Jane Girls were performing. And guess who also wanted to show up? Prince ended up having reserved seats for the concert that night. And backstage, Prince saw Rick James and Rod Stewart. And Rod Stewart said, and this is coming from the memoirs of the Super Freak book, that, and I quote, "I hate that little prick," unquote. So while Mary Jane Girls was doing their thing performing, Prince had his bodyguard carry him all throughout the concert, and he did this to get the attention off the Mary Jane Girls onto himself. When Rick James heard what Prince did, he was very angry, and again, he really wanted to whoop Prince's ass. And what ended up happening and shit like that was that Rick James saw Prince's bodyguard also attempt to throw Rod Stewart, Tina, and a few of his guests out and whatnot. And Rod Stewart's wife Alana pretty much told Prince to kiss her ass. And Rick James also said that Prince will later on do some similar shit to Michael Jackson's concert. Which, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if this is really true, but I think he's talking about the concert where James Brown and B.B. King had, and MJ did his thing, and he invited Prince on stage. But I could be wrong on that. If anybody really knows, let me know in the comments and shit like that. So now fast forward to 1984, and Prince and Rick James again was on very different lengths in their careers. Um, Rick James was pretty much on an issue of NME, and this was months before Prince would release the Purple Rain album and movie. And again, when asked about Prince, he pretty much said, and I quote, "Prince deals with sex and sex only. You've got love with me, hope in the future. I write about shit the way it is." Unquote. Now, throughout the 80s, Prince and Rick James would eventually, again, have different paths in their career. You know, with the Purple Rain success, you know, Prince would definitely have a lot of notoriety and success throughout the 80s. You know, when it comes to producing, when it comes to his albums, and of course, you know, his affiliates and whatnot, he pretty much was making a name for himself. And again, with the advance of the MTV generation, he definitely was, you know, up there with like Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston in terms of black performers from like the mid-80s. Rick James, on the other hand, by the time he got into the mid-80s, you know, his popularity was pretty much waning a bit. His music was not really played a lot on MTV, but at the same time, in the mid-80s, you know, he pretty much had, you know, hits like, he had hits, you know, with the Mary Jane Girls, you know, he was writing for. He did the Eddie Murphy song, Party All the Time. But at the same time, too, his music video was always getting banned on MTV. And this is something that Rick James has always noted and always talked about, you know, throughout interviews, saying that MTV was racist, you know, that the only blacks that they really played was Michael Jackson and Rick James. And he pretty much called, you know, not Michael Jackson and Rick James, Michael Jackson and Prince. And he pretty much, you know, called Prince, you know, a house nigga and stuff like that. So, also around that time too, you know, he was going through his legal issues with Motown because, you know, he told us that Motown wasn't paying all of his royalties and, you know, always had a lot of creative differences with Motown. And so, that same time too, you know, he was having his own issues because now he was heavily involved with drugs at that time. And, you know, a lot of his acts, you know, like the Stone City Band and Mary Jane Girls just quickly faded out into obscurity. And so he pretty much, you know, after his Motown contract ended with the release of 1986's The Flag, he was looking for like a lot of labels, you know, to sign him. And so Warner Brothers approached him, and he was kind of worrisome with signing to Warner Brothers because Prince, you know, was like one of the biggest stars on that label at that time. And so Warner Brothers, you know, they eventually agreed with Rick James and gave him a huge advance. And, you know, Rick James, you know, he slowed down on drugs and he got, you know, close with religion, close with God. And so he did the wonderful album, which came out in 1988, you know, on Warner Brothers, which wonderful, you know, it came out with the song Lucy's Rap with Roxanne Shante. And I want to say the title track was a single as well too, because I believe there's a video for that track. Yeah, I've already said my feelings about this album. I'm not a big fan of this album. Like, I try to give someone a chance, but yeah, this album did not really do it for me. And it peaked at number 12 on the R&B charts, but it also stalled at number 148 on the Billboard.
She don't scream and she don't holler.
So, with that being said, you know, the commercial departure of the album, you know, they eventually wanted the sexy Rick James back, and Warner Bros. And Rick James pretty much was arguing about the creative direction of the wonderful album. You know, talking about, you know, they didn't want this whole religion Rick James, they didn't want the dirty, sexy Rick James and whatnot. And so, this pretty much led to like a falling. This pretty much led to like a falling out, between Warner Brothers and Rick James after the commercial disappointment of the Wonderful album, and so they did not really promote the Wonderful album too, and they shelved the 1989 Kickin' album, which ended up being released in 2014. And so with that being said, Rick James' career was definitely as crossing roads at that time. And so, he really went back to drugs. But there's actually a theory that a lot of people, have been talking about when it came to the Wonderful album. And this is something that I've researched when it came to like a lot of forums and whatnot. So, with Wonderful coming out in July 5th of 1988, if you remember also that same year, Prince, rushed released the album Love Sexy, which Love Sexy originally took the place of the Black Album, which the Black Album was supposed to have came out in 1987, ended up coming out in 1994, which that is a story by itself, in my opinion. And so Love Sexy was released on May 10th of 1988, and the singles that it was released with was Alphabet Street, Glam Slam, and I Wish You Heaven. Yeah, that album took me a long time to get into. It's like one of my favorite Prince albums now, but at that time I wasn't really a big fan of it. I know that album was released where all the songs was released in like in one song, so you have to sit through the whole album. And so Prince made this album after an alleged acid trip or ecstasy trip, while he was, making the Black Album and stuff like that. So, yeah, man, this was a very, very controversial dope album. And so, with Warner Brothers, that album, it pretty much, charted on number 11 on the Billboard 200 and number 5 on the R&B Hip Hop Albums chart. And the reason why I mentioned Love Sexy is because, just like Rick, Prince was definitely experimenting a lot with this album and pretty much wanted to make a religious, positive album. And in February of '88, he sent out a test pressing of Love Sexy to Warner Brothers, and about the March 8th of 1988, he had a listening party for the album in LA. And with the album like that, I guess Warner Brothers didn't want like a similar album with Wonderful, because I guess they didn't want to release two religious albums at that same time. So I guess that's why they want to fuck around on that album in comparison to the Love Sexy album. That's just a theory that I picked up and stuff like that. So yeah.
I'm going down to Alphabet Street.
Now, as we further into the 90s, Rick James definitely would hit a lot of low points in his career. And none was as low as what had happened in 1991, whereas him and his girlfriend at the time, Tanya Hijazi, was arrested for allegedly torturing and burning a crack pipe on 24-year-old Frances Alley. And they held her hostage for up to a week, tying her up and whatnot. And so they were arrested because of that. And this came out 1 year after his song Super Freak was sampled from MC Hammer that you can't touch this. And so with that being said, he was getting like a little renewed popularity and shit like that, because everyone knows that Super Freak song and whatnot, and he successfully sued Hammer for songwriting royalties. And so Rick James and Tanya were booked for assault with a deadly weapon, false imprisonment, forced oral copulation, and making terrorist threats and furnishing narcotics. Rick was being held in lieu of $1 million bail, and Hijazi was held in a $500,000 bail and stuff like that. And the pair, they met this Tanya girl at a party, and apparently, did this, held a hostage during that whole party and stuff. So, yeah, that was very crazy. And also, in 1993, Rick James got in trouble again when he allegedly assaulted a music executive and whatnot. And this happened because, this had happened because of the fact that the music executive, Mary Sauger, assaulted his wife, Tanya, and Tanya was pregnant at the time. And so the two originally met for like a business meeting, but they ended up getting arrested. And while he was in trial, Rick James was found guilty on both offenses, but he was cleared of like the torture charge or whatnot, and he was serving a 5-year sentence at Folsom Prison. And so to add insult to injury, he also lost a civil suit to Mary Sauger, who was awarded $2 million in damages in 1994, and Rick James was ordered to pay her about $1 million. And the hotel and the private security firm was also found liable for $750,000, And while Rick James, while he was in prison, Prince definitely was, reinvented himself in the 90s as well too. He had his backing band, the New Power Generation, and by like the early 90s, he had dropped albums like the Graffiti Bridge album. He dropped, the Diamonds and Pearl album. He also dropped, the Love Symbol album. And so around the early 90s, he was having issues, with his label Warner Brothers at that time, because Warner Brothers, they were trying to control with like with his releases and his creative control, and that also postponed the release of the Gold Experience. And so Prince was trying to hurry up and get out of his contract with Warner Brothers, and that was the era when he had the slave written on his cheek, and that he changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol. And so with that being said, when he changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol in 1994, he had dropped the song "The Most Beautiful Girl in the World," and that was like a big song from 1994. And in order to get out of his contract, he had to like come up with albums. He had to like rush release the Black Album, which was supposed to have came out in '87 after Sign of the Times, came out in 1994. They finally released the Gold Experience. Chaos and Disorder was among one of them. And so in 1996, he was emancipated. He was emancipated and whatnot from Warner Brothers, and so he ended up making the album Emancipation, which Emancipation was just like a 3-disc album that was released with like a lot of variety of music. This was released on his NPG label, which was under EMI. Singles album was known for was Bet You by Golly Wow, The Holy River, Somebody Somebody, and Face Down. This album actually, when it came to the charts, it peaked at number 11 on the Billboard 200. Yeah, man. It's actually among one of the highest selling multi-disc albums of all time, because around that time, he also married Maite Garcia, who was a backup dancer in his tours and stuff like that. And, you guys should know that, they had some tragedy that happened when their child died shortly after birth, around 1996. So, they were going through a lot of that time. And with also that album being released with Chaos and Disorder, There was also a soundtrack movie release of Spike Lee's Girl 6 movie, which that was also released in 1996, and that album was pretty much, it was pretty much had like a compilation of some of Prince's oldest songs and stuff like that, but it also had a single called Girl 6 that was performed by the New Power Generation. You had songs from that soundtrack like Erotic City, Nasty Girl, Adore, because you know the movie Girl 6 pretty much had all Prince songs and stuff like that, you know. I definitely need to see that movie. I haven't heard a lot of people say good things about that movie. That album peaked at number 75 on the Billboard 200 and number 15 on the R&B hip hop albums chart. And it's been years since, you know, Prince and Rick James crossed paths with one another. And it's kind of crazy too because Rick James, that same year where Prince was releasing all that stuff, he was released from prison in 1996. He was released from prison in 1996. And around that time, you know, he was, you know, getting ready to release his album, his comeback album called Urban Rhapsody. But he said one final thing when it came to Prince and stuff like that, when he was like promoting the album and he was doing an unpublished interview. He said, and I quote, "I really want to do a double. My first concept was a triple album, and you know, that's too much for a triple album. You know, Prince did a triple album, didn't do very, and on and on and on and on. So I said, well, a double album. And I thought of a double album. Then after really giving a whole lot of thought and listening to a lot of material, because I've always wanted to do an acoustical unplugged album. And I, you know, now I've got about 4 in the can, you might say. And I didn't want to like a lay a heavy thing on people from my history back into the industry. I want to kind of ease back in with the familiarity stuff like they were familiar with. So I decided to do Urban Rhapsody. I'm excited to go back to the streets, to the street blues. Very much like my concept was a 90s street song thing. So that's really how Urban Rhapsody came into the play. And a lot of songs are about, more about my life. And I didn't lay a lot of the heavy stuff down because I didn't really want to burn people's souls, all that right on the first album, Uncle. And reportedly that was the last time you would hear Rick James say or mention anything about Prince. And that concludes their beef. So overall, when it comes to the conclusion of this whole Prince and Rick James beef, a lot of things are taken into consideration. Pretty much, it comes to the point where artists who fight for their independence don't really like to be compared to one another. And with the comparison to one another, they appears that anytime they get a single thread of comparison, they will always try to do something to out-top one another. I believe that when it came to whole Prince and Rick James, a lot of people have said it was pretty much one-sided because a lot of the interviews, a lot of the hate was mostly coming from Rick James, whereas the people who also say it's just one-sided because people sometimes say that Prince was influenced by Rick, the same way how people say that Rick was influenced by Prince. If you ask me, I think that sometimes when people say that imitation is the biggest flattery, it kind of goes the way how they can be influenced by it, but at the same time, if somebody tries to do what one other person is doing, that other person might do some shit that that other person who's copying that other person might not be used to. It might set the bar even higher. Now, I'm not saying that either Prince or James copied one another, but at the same time, too, I want to say that, you know, when it came to their lane in music, both of them was at the height creatively and innovated a lot of things that us artists do today. And with that being said, that concludes this episode on Why the Beef. Thank y'all so much for watching. I know this episode is a bit longer than usual. I think it's close to about 2 hours, so hope you guys pretty much like it. and stay tuned for my next episode. Peace.
Movies, videos, and doing all these songs. So it's like a lot of the, I can't say a lot, a few of the guys that Nas grew up with